Imagine waking up one morning feeling completely clear. No fog, no heaviness, no reaching for coffee before your eyes have finished opening. Just clarity. Your thoughts are sharp. Your mood is steady. Your body feels like it has been reset overnight, like something quietly repaired everything while you were gone. Now imagine this. You went to bed at 1:30 in the morning. That contradicts everything you have been told your entire life, doesn't it? And yet, that experience is real. It happens to people, not despite sleeping late, sometimes because of it. So the question that should be sitting in the front of your mind right now is this: what does waking up fresh actually depend on? Because if it isn't bedtime, and the science suggests it often isn't, then something far more interesting is happening inside your sleeping brain than anyone has ever told you. Here is a contradiction worth sitting with. Society has handed you a moral framework around sleep. Go to bed early, wake up early. The early bird gets the worm. Benjamin Franklin turned it into a gospel. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Proverbs, productivity culture, corporate schedules, school start times, all of them embed the same invisible assumption. That morning people are disciplined and night people are failing. But what if that entire framing is not a truth about human biology, but a bias about industrial productivity? What if the cultural narrative you absorbed about your sleep schedule is less about your health and more about making you available for the 9-to-5 world at the exact moment that world demands your presence? And what if, for a significant portion of humanity, forcing compliance with that schedule is the actual source of the exhaustion, the brain fog, the Monday morning dread? Here is what makes this psychologically fascinating. Researchers have found that the preference for late sleep is not a habit. It is not laziness. It is not a character flaw that can be disciplined away with enough willpower. For many people, it is written into their DNA, into the very genes that regulate their biological clock. The question isn't whether you should sleep late. The question is, why does your body insist on it? And what happens inside your brain when it finally gets what it needs? Let's go deeper. Because the answer begins not with a clock on the wall, but with a cluster of neurons deep inside your brain. In the hypothalamus, there is a structure called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It is your body's master clock. It governs when melatonin is released, when cortisol surges, when your core temperature rises, and when the brain is prepared to shift from unconsciousness back into waking life. This clock runs on a roughly 24-hour cycle. But critically, it does not run on the same 24-hour timing for every person. Chronobiology, the science of biological time, has identified what are called chronotypes, your natural, the genetically influenced disposition towards sleep and wake timing. Research on the PER3 and clock genes confirms that the evening preference carried by night owls is not psychological resistance. It is hereditary. Their circadian clock is genuinely shifted later by 1 to 3 hours compared to the societal norm. This means something profound. When a night owl sleeps from 1 in the morning to 9 in the morning, they are sleeping in alignment with their biology. When that same person is forced to wake at 6 in the morning for a job, for school, for social obligation, they experience what researchers call social jet lag, a chronic misalignment between biological time and social time. And social jet lag produces the same cognitive impairments as literal transatlantic jet lag every single day. Think about what that means. And millions of people are walking through their lives in a state of permanent, low-grade cognitive impairment. Not because they slept too much or too little, but because the timing of their sleep is chronically misaligned with the timing their biology demands. Carl Jung once observed that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. But there is a quieter version of that burden carried by every night owl who has spent decades believing they are broken, when in truth, they are simply operating on a different biological time zone than the one the world has declared normal. The shame that accumulates around sleeping late is not merely uncomfortable. It is psychologically active, and it creates what researchers call performance anxiety about sleep, a meta-stress about the act of resting, which itself disrupts the very sleep architecture it fears. You lie awake, stressed about being awake, your arousal system's fully activated, your brain doing the precise opposite of what sleep requires. The hidden problem, then, is not the lateness of the sleep. It is the misalignment, and the psychological weight of the cultural story told about it. Now let's pull the architecture apart and look at what sleep actually is, because this is where the consequences become visible. Sleep is not a single state. It is a cycling architecture of distinct stages, each with a specific psychological and physiological function. Approximately every 90 minutes, your brain moves through a full cycle: light sleep, and then deep, slow-wave sleep, where growth hormone is released, physical tissue is repaired, and the brain clears metabolic waste through what is called the glymphatic system. And then into REM sleep, where emotional memories are processed, creative connections are formed, and procedural learning is consolidated. Here is the piece that most people never hear. REM sleep is not evenly distributed across the night. The first half of sleep is dominated by slow-wave, physically restorative, deep sleep. The second half, the later hours, shifts dramatically toward REM, toward the psychologically richest, most emotionally regulatory, most creatively generative stage. This means that when you set an alarm to wake at 6 in the morning, when your body biologically needs 8 in the morning, you are not just losing 2 hours of sleep. You are surgically removing the most psychologically vital phase of your night. You are amputating exactly the stage responsible for emotional balance, creative insight, and mood stability. And then wondering why you feel flat, reactive, and creatively dead by noon. The cognitive consequences compound invisibly. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought, emotional regulation, and long-term decision-making, is exquisitely sensitive to REM deprivation. Studies have shown that consistent curtailment of late sleep REM produces measurable declines in executive function, empathy, and stress tolerance. The person who drags themselves out of bed at an hour their biology never agreed to is not experiencing a rough morning. They are experiencing a neurological deficit, one that follows them into every meeting, every conversation, and every decision of the day. Viktor Frankl wrote that suffering ceases to be suffering when it finds meaning. But here is the darker corollary. When suffering has no assigned meaning, when it is simply chronic, invisible, socially normalized misalignment, it quietly erodes identity. People who are chronically sleep misaligned often describe a persistent sense of not fully arriving anywhere, of watching their own life through glass, of emotional responses that feel slightly delayed, slightly muted. That is not a personality trait. That is a brain deprived of its most essential psychological restoration. But here is what most people never realize. The solution is not to force yourself to sleep earlier. That strategy, applied against a resistant chronotype, consistently fails. Because you cannot override a genetic biological clock through willpower alone. The real solution is something far more counterintuitive. It is not about when you sleep. It is about how completely, how consistently, and how psychologically aligned your sleep is, at whatever time your biology actually wants it. Let us build the full picture. The single most important variable in whether you wake up feeling fresh, more important than bedtime, more important than total hours, is something called adenosine clearance. During every hour you are awake, a chemical called adenosine accumulates in your brain. It is the molecular record of wakefulness, the biological pressure that builds until sleep becomes unavoidable. During sleep, particularly during slow-wave deep sleep, adenosine is cleared. When you wake after a full, uninterrupted sleep cycle, adenosine has been fully metabolized. Your neurochemical slate is clean. You wake with clarity because your brain has literally cleared the biochemical residue of the day before. But when sleep is cut short, when you wake before your cycles are complete, residual adenosine remains. And that is the fog you feel. That dragging, heavy, underwater sensation people attribute to sleeping too late is almost always the precise opposite. It is the sensation of sleep that was not long enough, not complete enough, or not undisturbed enough. Then there is the cortisol awakening response. In the first 20 to 30 minutes after waking, a healthy brain produces a sharp, intentional spike in cortisol. Not stress cortisol. Activating cortisol, the biological ignition of alertness, for motivation and mental engagement. This is your brain's natural energizing mechanism, firing without a single cup of coffee. The cortisol awakening response is strongest when three conditions are met. You wake at a consistent time, aligned with your chronotype, and your sleep was complete. Night owls who wake consistently at 8:30 in the morning develop a robust, reliable response at exactly that hour. Their brain anticipates the wake time. It prepares. It fires on schedule. The result is a morning that begins with natural neurochemical energy rather than the grinding friction of forcing a system online before it is ready. Contrast this with the person who wakes at 5:45 in the morning on weekdays and 10 in the morning on weekends, perpetually resetting their biological clock. You're never allowing the master clock to stabilize, never allowing the cortisol response to calibrate. That person is, neurologically, in a state of constant mild jet lag. Not because they sleep late, because they sleep inconsistently. And then there is light, the most powerful external modulator of the circadian system. Your master clock is directly connected to your retinas. Light is its primary language. When you wake, at whatever hour your biology has chosen, and expose your eyes to bright natural light within the first 5 minutes, you send an unambiguous signal to the master clock. The day has begun. Melatonin production stops. The cortisol cascade begins. Your biological clock anchors itself to that moment. It used deliberately as a tool rather than an accident. Morning light exposure is the fastest way to consolidate your circadian rhythm around your natural wake time and reduce sleep inertia to near zero. It works at 6 in the morning. It works equally well at 9 in the morning. What it cannot do is compensate for cycles that were never completed. Everything changes when you see this. Freshness upon waking is not a reward for virtue. It is not granted to those who suffer the alarm earliest. It is a neurochemical outcome. Precise, reproducible, and largely independent of the time shown on the clock. And once you understand how to engineer that outcome, the entire conversation about whether sleeping late is acceptable becomes irrelevant. So what does the psychology of waking fresh actually look like in practice? The first rebellion is against inconsistency. The circadian clock is not set by bedtime. It is anchored primarily by wake time. Your master clock calibrates itself to the light signal and the behavioral pattern of when you get out of bed. If you can commit to a single consistent wake time, even if bedtime varies slightly, your entire circadian architecture begins to stabilize around that anchor. Melatonin starts releasing at the right time the night before. Adenosine reaches its peak at the right hour. The cortisol response fires on schedule. The system self-organizes. The second rebellion is against the chaotic pre-sleep environment. What you do in the 60 to 90 minutes before sleep determines the depth of restoration that follows. This is pre-sleep psychology, and it is profoundly underestimated. Research by Michael Scullin at Baylor University found that writing a to-do list before sleep, a complete worry dump that externalizes unresolved thoughts from working memory, reduced the time needed to fall asleep by an average of 9 minutes, comparable in some studies to pharmacological sleep aids. The mechanism is elegant. When your prefrontal cortex holds unresolved tasks in active memory, it resists deactivation. The brain treats open loops as ongoing threats. Writing them down signals that they have been captured, that they can be safely released until morning. The system deactivates. Sleep deepens. Similarly, a warm shower taken 1 to 2 hours before bed is not merely a comfort. Vasodilation in the skin rapidly drops core body temperature, a precise physiological signal that accelerates sleep onset and deepens slow-wave sleep. It is thermal priming. The body is being prepared deliberately for the architecture of deep restoration. The third rebellion, and perhaps the most psychologically radical, is against the moral narrative itself. Studies on cognitive performance, creativity, and life satisfaction show no consistent advantage for morning chronotypes over evening chronotypes when biological alignment is controlled for. In fact, multiple large-scale studies have found that evening types score higher on average in measures of intelligence, creative thinking, and openness to experience. The night owl who works from 10 in the morning to 7 in the evening, after a complete and biologically aligned sleep cycle, will consistently outperform the same person dragged into a 6 in the morning schedule. Not from laziness, from neuroscience. The brain operating in alignment with its own clock simply functions at a higher level than the brain fighting that clock every single day. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that existence precedes essence, that we are not defined in advance, but constructed through our choices. Applied to sleep, this means you are not condemned by your chronotype. You are invited to build a life that honors it. That is not self-indulgence. That is the sophisticated act of aligning your external circumstances with your internal biology, so that both can function at their highest level simultaneously. And now, the deepest layer, the one that makes everything else click into place. The reason so many people feel exhausted, flat, and mentally foggy, despite getting what seems like enough sleep, is not that they are sleeping at the wrong hour. It is that they are living in a sustained state of biological misalignment and psychological self-blame, where the very act of trying to fix the problem creates the conditions that perpetuate it. Sleep anxiety disrupts sleep architecture. Inconsistency prevents circadian calibration. Waking too early amputates REM. Residual adenosine produces fog that confirms the belief that something is wrong with you. And that belief generates more anxiety, completing the loop. The exit from that loop is not a new alarm time. It is understanding. When you know that your preference for late sleep is biological, not moral, the self-blame dissolves. When you know that adenosine clearance, Xiao's not clock time, determines freshness, you stop measuring your sleep by the wrong standard. When you know that REM sleep lives in your final hours, you stop treating those hours as optional. When you know that consistency of wake time is the master lever of circadian stability, you gain control over the one variable that matters most. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that to live is to suffer, and to survive is to find meaning in that suffering. But perhaps the deepest psychological gift of understanding your own sleep is something quieter than that. It is the removal of suffering that was never necessary. The restoration of rest that was always available, simply waiting for you to stop fighting your own biology long enough to receive it. The question was never, am I allowed to sleep late? And the real question was always, do I understand what my sleeping brain actually needs? And am I willing to give it that? Somewhere, right now, someone is lying awake at midnight. Mind turning over the events of the day, dreading the alarm, calculating hours, already bracing for the weight of tomorrow morning. They have been told their entire life that this struggle is their fault. That if they would just go to bed earlier, just wake up earlier, just try harder, it would stop. But the truth, quiet, biological, patient, has always been waiting underneath that story. Your brain is not broken. Your rhythm is not wrong. Your need for the late hours, for the slow mornings, for the full completion of sleep, is not weakness. It is your nervous system asking, with extraordinary consistency, for exactly what it needs to rebuild you overnight. Give it that. Not out of indulgence, out of understanding. Because the most productive, the most creative, the most emotionally present version of you has always lived on the other side of a complete night's sleep, however late that night may begin. If something in this video shifted how you see your own sleep or your own biology, there is more where this came from. This channel goes deep into the psychology of how you actually work, not how you have been told you should. Subscribe if that is the kind of thinking you want more of. And when you are ready, the next video is waiting. Because now that you understand why you wake up the way you do, the next question is, what is your brain actually doing when it refuses to let you sleep, even when you are exhausted? That is the psychology of insomnia, and it is far stranger and more fascinating than you expect.